Hey guys, so wanted to share with you a new opening that I've been looking into. I've been kind of trying to find an alternative response to the Sicilian when you're playing as white, and I came across quite an unusual approach. It's called the Snyder variation, and it goes e4, c5, so the Sicilian, and the Snyder is to b3. And the idea is that you're going to pop your bishop, fianchetto your bishop there on b2 and have it looking down towards the king side. But I've played a couple of games on this, and I thought I'd just share those games with you because they're quite fun and quite informative. So in this first game, my opponent plays g6, so he's looking to fianchetto his bishop as well. However, I get mine in first, so now he can't do his. His rook's under attack. He can't put his bishop there because I'll just take it and then take the rook. So now he's forced to play f6, really. So I bring my other bishop out to c4. So now it feels a bit like the Danish, you know, with these two bishops slicing the board in half. This bishop's obviously looking at the knight there, and the pawns around the king, you know, having already had to move the f-pawn. Black's already compromised. And with the Sicilian starting with 1c5, where's this king going to go? It's already on move 4. It's starting to look a bit ropey. So now he puts his bishop there, but now it's stuck behind a pawn, and I decide to shoot in and just grab the knight. So rook recaptures, and now the king cannot castle short. So develop my knight, he develops his knight, I castle just to rub his nose in it. E6 is played, and d3. So got a nice comfortable pawn structure here, and my knight will have options to get out into the board a couple of different ways. Then e5, and then f5, and now I decide to take off his other bishop, and the rook captures. Then I push e5, so plugging up the middle of the board here. Now, of course, because his king hasn't castled yet, it does make sense for me to try and open up the middle. So I put my rook on e1, he starts pushing pawns up the king side, I develop my other knight, and now I think let's go for it. So d4, pushing pawns up, he attacks my knight, I have to move out of the way. So my knight's a bit awkward there on h4. Then he grabs the pawn that the knight was defending, I reroute my knight, and now queen takes e5. So here comes a really cool sequence of moves. So we have knight takes d4 with a discovered attack on the queen from my rook. So he's got a couple of options. He could capture, well, he can't capture with the pawn because then I take the queen. So queen takes is pretty much forced. But what I had spotted was the next move, which is really glorious. Knight takes f5. The pawn can't recapture because it's actually now pinned, right? So if I go back a couple of moves, with so the queen comes in, discovered attack on the queen, and after the queen moves, this pawn is now the only piece in between my rook and the king. So that little rook to e1 move was turned out really helpful. So now knight comes in, so not only have I got my pawn back, I'm forking the queen and the rook. And now we have an exchange of queens, but stop and have a think, pause if you need to. What move would you play next if you were white in this position? Now the beginner would almost certainly play like rook a takes the queen, okay, and that would be all right. This pawn is still pinned, it can't capture the knight, but there's an in-between move. I don't have to recapture the queen immediately because I can play knight takes g7, okay, then the king comes out, and now I recapture the queen, and now the king takes my knight. So what I've done there is that I've won the exchange. So now I've given up my knight for a rook, okay? We've got an isolated king, and we've got black has got a light square bishop and a rook, but both of these are actually still undeveloped and stuck in. So after my next move, rook to e5, black actually resigned. So that was my first outing with the Snyder Anti-Sicilian, and let's go on to game number 2, which is also interesting with a nice twist as well. So e4, c5, the Snyder variation, pawn to b3, pawn comes out to e6, and I fianchetto my dark square bishop. Now we have d5, takes and takes. So black has the central control. I have a nice fianchetto bishop. Now queen to e2 check, bishop blocks the check, queen to b5 check, queen blocks, and now knight to f3, right? I don't have to exchange my queen, because the queen is actually defended by this bishop, right? So if black wants to take a turn capturing my queen, I recapture again with check, and I've developed a piece. You see the difference, right, with this move? If I say capture and knight captures, black has developed a piece for free, right? But alternatively, if I do something else like I did in the game, and then black captures and I recapture, then I've developed a piece. So it makes the difference between who's effectively playing black and who's effectively playing white. Okay, so here we go. Now black initiates the trade. I recapture with the bishop with check, and now we have a pinned knight there on d7. So I come in and attack the pinned piece. And now I make a blunder. Okay. So it's not immediately, but rook comes across to defend the knight. I bring out my knight, and now he kicks the bishop away. And clearly I can't just come back here because it'll be followed by b5 and my bishop's trapped, right? But the problem is that the bishop is the piece that's maintaining this pin on the knight. So without the bishop on this diagonal, this knight is no longer pinned and is free to go around capturing my knight. So I drop my bishop back, and here's the other problem, right? Because I had developed this knight out to c3, it's blocked this bishop's defense of that knight. So now kicks, bishop moves, and I am a piece down, ladies and gentlemen. Shock horror, this is not good, right? On the plus side, black is a little way off castling. He's got 3 pieces that have not entered the game yet. Both my bishops, my knight are all quite active, so at least I have some kind of initiative going on. So I decide to castle long. Black brings out a knight. I kick one knight and move my rook across now to defend the f2 square. We don't want a knight jumping in there, do we? Okay, so comes along. Now he attacks with the pawn. I attack his knight. He counterattacks my knight. I retreat my knight to d1. He now attacks my bishop. Bishop f3, takes, 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 takes. And now check with the rook. King back to b1. Knight retreats to h6. And now I can grab this pawn. Okay, so what's interesting is I'm attacking the rook. I'm also attacking this pawn in a fork, but either square that the rook could go to defend the pawn are also attacked by the bishop. So what do you do as black in this situation? Okay, so he pins the bishop. Well, it's not a pin, it's like a skewer. But I move out of that with check. So I could have just grabbed the pawn, but then he would just grab b3, either with the bishop or the rook. So I move my bishop there. He blocks and pinning his own knight in the process. So now I come up with another pawn, and I'm trying to cause trouble for these pieces here and try and disrupt any king safety that black might get. So now rook takes the pawn. I push on and attack the bishop. Bishop's only got 2 squares, but realistically only 1 that it can go to safely. Now I capture the knight with check. So this is forcing the king to come out into the board, forcing the king to move. King can no longer castle, and It's just slowing down the development of these pieces. Okay, so now rook out, bishop out, attacks the knight, check, king there, knight comes round, attacking the bishop again, and we have a bishop coming out, so this bishop is pinned and is going to fall. So I grab his bishop, he grabs mine, king to a1. Alright, so now, if you look at this structure as well, what's interesting is I've only got one minor piece. I've got this knight, okay? My king is now very, very exposed on the queen side, but his knight, so he's got a good bishop, he's got a rook that hasn't yet developed, but this knight here is actually trapped by this wall of pawns and by his own pawn on f7, which is going to have to move at some point. So rook comes out, attacking my knight, I respond with check, he moves out the way, I move back, so now attacking the bishop, I figure that if I can get his bishop off the board, that's all fine, so I get the bishop, and now we enter the really quite interesting part of the game, where black is clearly ahead. I mean, he's ahead of material. He has an extra knight and an extra pawn, all right? But how does he win? So I move my rook out, so now my rook can come up to here or to here with check or attacking the pawns. Now the f-pawn moves, so the knight will have a route out into the board. It also takes away the e5 square from my rook, so I come back to attack these pawns. And now we have rook to c2. Now the risk is this rook from d2 goes down to d1, which would be checkmate, so we can't have that. So my rook now drops back, forgets about the pawns, has to come back and defend. This is something I've identified that I need to work on this week, is never forgetting to defend. Right? Too many games recently I've been too focused on my attack and just fallen to a counter-attack. So now the rook comes across to b1 with check, kicking the king. Now the king cannot stay on the b file, and it also can't go onto the a file because of my other rook, so the king is going to have to come out onto the c file, and when it does, I at least grab the pawn. Okay, now the king starts to come round, I attack the knight, and we have rook to h2. So he's either going to be attacking these pawns. He can't really go to there because I've just got rook takes. So at this point, why didn't I just capture the knight? So instead I throw in a check, and then I move my rook across again. So still no major risk of checkmate here, but now the knight comes in, and now I pin the knight on the king. Rook defends the knight, I bring my king slightly into the board, and he starts taking my pawns. Okay, so rook to g2 with check. Rook then comes back to the open file. Rook comes in with check. Now this is not, he can't checkmate me this way because his rooks are too close, right? So if this rook comes across, I can just capture that one. So I have to keep my king in tight to the rooks. So now he moves away, I move up. Now he comes across, grabs another pawn, and now I spot my chance. Okay, rook to b7. Now, this is one of those times when you need your little spider senses tuned in and working as black. So black is clearly in the ascendancy on this. He's got this game, he just needs to convert it. He's 2 pawns up and a whole knight. So this game is his to lose. So what does he do? He throws in a check. I come down, so there's no more checks. He can't check there or there because I can capture. He could throw in this one, but then again I move to here, so we're all right. And now a blunder. Rook to g2. So you can see what he's trying to do, right? He's pinned this rook. So the idea is he could now come down here with a knight or here with a knight, and that rook is his for the taking. However, there's a winning move for white. Rook to b1, this is what I spotted. This was my last chance, desperate gasp of maybe winning this game. and my opponent is forced to resign. There's only one legal move that he can make. The king can't go anywhere, and the only move would be rook to c1, then b takes c1, and it's checkmate. So got away with that one completely by the skin of my teeth, having blundered a minor piece very early on in the game. So what do we make of this opening? With the bishop on there, it could be fun. But I think what's interesting about it is that if we go, let's go on to, I haven't logged in. It's a very unusual response. So whatever level you're at, when you're playing people who've prepared the Sicilian, they won't have prepared against this unless you're playing at a very, very high standard. So it's a good way just to knock them off their guard. You can play your pawn out to c4. As we've seen, it can really kind of mess up the board and create opportunities for lots of fun. So I've done a little bit of research on the theory of it, and I will be taking this one out for a few spins in the wild and see how we get on. But if you've been looking for an interesting and unusual way to respond to the Sicilian defence, then try this one. It does seem to be sound, and it does also seem to be quite fun as well. So there you go, thought I'd share. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Otherwise, see you soon.